They called him a coward before they ever learned what he had already given up. The restraints bit cold against Lucas Grant's wrists, magnetic cuffs humming softly with every micro-adjustment as the alien transport hovered just above the fractured ground. Its undercarriage casting a shifting grid of violet light across the dust and scattered debris below, the air thick with the sharp tang of ionized particles and overheated circuitry. His boots barely touching the surface as the gravity field fluctuated in uneven pulses that made his balance feel just slightly off, just enough to remind him he didn't belong here. Not anymore. Not to them. Not to anyone. Across from him, a line of armored alien soldiers stood in perfect formation, their tall silhouettes outlined by the distant glow of burning structures on the horizon, their cobalt and obsidian armor plates reflecting flickers of orange light as if the fire itself had chosen them as mirrors. Their helmets sleek and expressionless except for the faint golden slits where their eyes tracked him with detached curiosity and then amusement, one of them tilting its head just enough for the external translator to pick up the tone even before the words came through. Unarmed. No rank insignia. No weapon signature. This is your soldier? The voice carried a sharp edge. Not anger. Not even hostility. Just something colder. Something like dismissal. And a ripple of low, clicking laughter passed through the line as another step closer, boots striking the ground with precise, measured weight. They send us this? Lucas didn't respond, didn't lift his head, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond them where the skyline flickered with intermittent flashes, each one followed by a distant, delayed tremor that traveled through the soles of his boots and into his bones. The suit he wore no longer military issue, just a patched utility rig with a failing thermal regulator that blinked amber across his wrist display. Oxygen stable, temperature rising, systems degraded. It didn't matter. None of it mattered anymore. Not since he had dropped his rifle hours ago. Not since he had made the decision that now stood between him and whatever came next. Look at him. Another voice chimed in. This one almost curious. No weapon. No defensive field. He surrendered before engagement. More laughter, softer this time, like a private joke shared across a species that had already decided what he was worth. Lucas exhaled slowly, the breath fogging faintly in the unstable air as he shifted his weight, the cuffs tightening for a fraction of a second before recalibrating. A warning without words, and still he said nothing, because anything he could say would sound like an excuse, and excuses didn't survive in places like this. Above them, the transport's engine core pulsed brighter, casting long shadows that stretched and warped across the broken terrain, and for a moment, the wind shifted, carrying with it a distant sound that didn't belong to the steady rhythm of machinery or the disciplined movement of soldiers. Something deeper, something rolling beneath the surface like a storm gathering just out of sight. Lucas's eyes lifted slightly, just enough to catch the flicker of something changing on the horizon. A line of light bending where it shouldn't, pressure building in the air like the world itself was holding its breath. One of the alien soldiers noticed it too, turning its helmet a few degrees, the golden slit narrowing. Thermal spike detected. It said, tone sharpening just a fraction, the laughter fading as quickly as it had come, replaced by a quiet recalibration of posture, weapons adjusting, systems engaging, and for the first time since they had looked at him, none of them were smiling anymore. But Lucas already knew what was coming. He had seen it once before, felt it in the way the air tightened, in the way the ground seemed to brace, and this time, there would be no time to run, no time to explain. Only a choice, the same choice that had already cost him everything. And as the first wave of heat shimmered across the distance, bending light and shadow into something unreal, he closed his eyes for half a second and let the silence settle, because he understood something they didn't. Something they couldn't measure with scanners or rank or weapons, that being unarmed didn't mean being empty. And whatever came through that firestorm, he would face it the same way he had faced everything else, with nothing left to drop and nothing left to prove. The first shockwave did not arrive as sound but as pressure, a silent push against the air that bent the rising heat into ripples, distorting the horizon until the distant structures looked like reflections in moving water, and every sensor on the alien soldiers flickered in response, their armor emitting sharp diagnostic tones as their formation broke by a fraction of an inch, not enough to call disorder, but enough to betray uncertainty. Energy front expanding. One of them reported, voice no longer amused. Estimated impact in 12 seconds. The transport above adjusted position with a low mechanical groan, its stabilizers extending as if preparing to ascend. To leave, and Lucas felt the shift immediately, the subtle lift in gravity, the decision being made without him. Without any of them. Protocol over presence, survival over command. He lowered his gaze again, watching the dust at his feet begin to tremble, fine grains lifting and falling in uneven patterns as the temperature climbed, his wrist display flickering from amber to red, external heat exceeding tolerance, suit integrity compromised, warning tones stacking one over another until they blurred into a single continuous note. And still the cuffs held him in place, still the soldiers hesitated, waiting for an order that had not yet come. Prepare for extraction. Another voice called, sharper now. Leader has not returned. There it was, the missing piece, the absence that mattered more than the prisoner in front of them. Lucas's eyes shifted toward the fractured ridge beyond the landing zone, where the ground dipped into a collapsed corridor of metal and stone, half buried beneath a tangle of structural debris that still glowed faintly with residual heat. He had seen that formation before, minutes earlier, when the sky had first broken open and everything had turned white for just a second too long. He had seen a figure there, tall, armored, moving against the current before disappearing beneath the falling mass. Commander's signal lost. One of the soldiers confirmed, and for the first time there was something in the voice that resembled concern. Not for him, never for him, but for the one they had followed into this place. Lucas inhaled slowly, the air dry and metallic in his lungs, and when he exhaled, he made his decision before his body even moved. Release me, he said, his voice steady, not loud, not demanding, just present. The nearest soldier turned its helmet toward him, golden slit narrowing again, recalibrating, reassessing. You are in no position to make requests, it replied, but the edge was gone now, replaced by calculation. Lucas lifted his bound hand slightly, enough to show the empty space between his fingers. I know where she is, he said, and that was enough, not trust, not belief, but enough to interrupt the certainty that had defined them moments ago. A brief exchange of signals passed between the soldiers, silent, instantaneous, and then the cuffs disengaged with a sharp click, dropping the hum and releasing his wrist with a sudden absence of pressure that almost felt heavier than the restraint itself. You will guide, the soldier said, and if you are wrong, it did not finish the sentence. It did not need to. Lucas rolled his shoulders once, feeling the stiffness settle into motion, the heat pressing harder against his skin now that nothing stood between him and the air, and without another word he stepped forward, past the line that had held him, past the place where they had laughed, moving toward the fractured ridge as the light intensified, the second wave already visible now, a wall of shimmering distortion racing toward them at a speed no one could outrun, and for a moment, just a moment, he heard one of them speak again, quieter this time, almost to itself. Why would he go back? Lucas did not answer, because the truth was not something they could scan, not something they could measure. It was simply a direction, and he followed it straight into the heat. The heat hit him before the light fully arrived, not as a burn, but as a weight pressing against his chest, each breath thinner than the last as the air itself seemed to resist movement. Lucas leaned forward into it, boots sliding half an inch with every step across the fractured surface, the ground uneven and shifting beneath loose metal plates that groaned under pressure, his suit display flickering violently now, temperature climbing past safe thresholds, internal cooling failing in slow increments. He ignored it, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean turning back, and that was not an option anymore. Behind him the alien soldiers followed at a distance, their formation broken into a staggered line as their armor compensated for the rising thermal distortion, their movements still precise but no longer effortless, radiation spike increasing. One of them reported, voice tight with calculation, "We have less than 2 minutes." Lucas did not respond, his eyes fixed on the collapsed ridge ahead, the jagged outline of twisted alloy beams and fractured panels forming a half-buried corridor that pulsed faintly with residual energy. The place where he had seen her disappear, where the ground had opened and swallowed command along with it. He reached the edge and dropped down into the shallow incline, boots crunching against compacted debris that still held heat like a memory. The air thicker here, trapped between layers of collapsed structure. Every surface radiating warmth that pressed against his skin through the failing suit. He crouched, scanning quickly, not with instruments but with instinct, looking for disruption, for something that did not match the pattern of destruction. And then he saw it, a faint shift beneath a slab angled at 45 degrees, not movement exactly, more like resistance, as if something beneath it had refused to settle when everything else fell. Lucas stepped closer, hands already reaching, ignoring the warning pulse from his wrist display as he pressed his palms against the heated surface. It was heavier than it looked, anchored by debris on one side. He adjusted his stance, boots finding unstable purchase, and pushed, not with force but with direction, shifting the angle just enough to break the seal. The slab moved an inch, then another, and a thin line of cooler air slipped through the gap. He widened it, just enough to see her, armor dulled by ash and heat, one arm pinned beneath a fractured beam, her helmet partially deactivated, revealing a face that did not match the image of command he had seen earlier. The sharp lines softened by stillness, the golden eyes closed but not empty, not gone, just waiting. Commander located. One of the soldiers called from above, the tone different now, no longer detached. Lucas did not look back. He shifted the slab further, bracing it with his shoulder as he reached in with his free hand. Careful, precise. Not because of training, but because anything careless here would cost time they did not have. Her armor was warm to the touch but intact, structural integrity holding. He found the release points along the pinned section, fingers working through the interface until the locking mechanism disengaged with a soft click. The beam lifted slightly as the internal supports redistributed weight, enough for him to slide her arm free. Her eyes opened then, slow, unfocused at first, then locking onto him with a clarity that cut through the heat and noise. Confusion flickering for half a second before recognition followed, not of him, but of what he was, human, unarmed, the same one they had dismissed. You, she said, the word quiet, edged with disbelief rather than accusation. Lucas met her gaze for just a moment, long enough to anchor the reality of it, then shifted his grip, one arm supporting her back, the other securing her balance as he pulled her fully from beneath the debris, her weight settling against him, heavier than expected but manageable, his suit protesting with every adjustment, servos lagging, systems straining. We need to move, he said, not as an order, not as a request, just a fact. Above them the light intensified again, the second wave nearly upon them now, the air vibrating with energy that made the edges of everything blur, and for the first time since she had looked at him, the commander did not argue, did not question. She simply let him lift her, and as he turned back toward the open ground, the soldiers waiting at the ridge fell silent, not because they understood, but because for the first time, they did not. The moment he stepped back into the open, the world narrowed to distance and heat. Nothing else, not the soldiers waiting at the ridge, not the transport hovering above, not even the commander in his arms, only the path ahead and the timing that would decide everything. Lucas adjusted his grip, lifting her higher against his shoulder as his boots found the slope again. Each step heavier than the last as the suit struggled to keep up with the load and the temperature climbing past what it was ever designed to handle. Warning lights pulsed in rapid sequence across his wrist, core temperature critical, structural fatigue increasing. He ignored them all, focusing instead on the rhythm. Step, breathe, step, breathe. The commander shifted slightly against him, not resisting, not helping, simply present, her armor warm through the thin layer of his gloves, her breathing steady but shallow. You should have left, she said, her voice quieter now, less command, more observation. Lucas did not slow, did not look at her. Not how I work, he replied, the words simple, almost automatic, but they held, and for a moment there was nothing else between them but movement. Above the ridge the alien soldiers repositioned, their weapons lowered now, not aimed, not ready, just held, as if they no longer knew what to prepare for. Thermal front in 10 seconds. One of them called, urgency cutting through the static. The light behind Lucas surged brighter, stretching shadows forward until they merged into one long, distorted shape that moved with him. The air vibrating harder now, a low hum building beneath everything. Not sound exactly, more like pressure given a voice. Lucas reached the top of the incline and did not stop, crossing the last stretch of broken ground toward the soldiers as the first edge of the wave touched the ridge behind him. The heat followed immediately, a wall of force that bent the air into shimmering layers. His suit alarms collapsed into a single continuous tone, then cut out entirely, systems overloaded, gone, leaving only the raw sensation of heat pressing through fabric and skin. He leaned forward into it, shifting his weight to keep balance as the ground seemed to push back. The commander's hand tightened slightly against his shoulder, not in fear, not in pain, just contact, a silent acknowledgement that she was still there, still aware, human. One of the soldiers said, the word no longer a label, no longer a dismissal, something else now, something uncertain. Lucas closed the last few feet, boots sliding half an inch as the surface shifted under the thermal distortion. And then he crossed the line where they stood, where the transport stabilizers cast a narrow field of relative calm. The difference immediate, the pressure easing just enough to breathe fully again, just enough to think. He lowered her carefully, not dropping, not collapsing, but placing her into the space they made without speaking, the soldiers stepping back instinctively, forming a circle that no longer felt like containment, but like recognition. Lucas straightened slowly, his arms heavy, his vision narrowing at the edges as the delayed impact of everything caught up at once. The heat, the strain, the choice. The commander looked up at him from where he had set her down, her golden eyes steady now, clear, not questioning, not confused, just fixed on him with an intensity that carried no rank, no distance. You knew, she said, not asking, and Lucas nodded once, a small movement, almost lost in the fading light. Yes, he answered, and that was all, because anything more would have made it something else, something larger than it was, and it was not. It was just a decision made in a moment that no one else had chosen. The transport above adjusted position again, this time not to leave but to hold, to wait, and as the last of the heat rolled past them and the air settled into something almost still, one of the soldiers lowered its weapon completely, the motion deliberate, visible, a signal not just to the others but to him, and for the first time since they had seen him, there was no calculation left in the way they looked at him, only the quiet, unsettled realization that whatever they had measured before had been wrong. The silence after the storm did not feel like relief. It felt like something unfinished, as if the world had paused just long enough to take a breath before deciding what came next. The air still shimmered faintly with residual heat, bending the edges of the transport shadow into soft distortions across the ground. Lucas stood where he had stopped, shoulders heavy, hands empty, his suit display completely dark now. No readings, no warnings. Just a dead screen reflecting the faint glow of the sky above. He flexed his fingers once, slow, testing, the stiffness settling into something manageable as the adrenaline faded. Around him the alien soldiers moved with quiet precision. But the rhythm had changed, their steps no longer synchronized by protocol alone. There was hesitation now, not weakness, but awareness, each motion measured against something they had not accounted for before. Two of them knelt beside their commander, their armor panels opening in smooth segments to reveal diagnostic interfaces that projected soft bands of light across her suit, scanning, stabilizing, confirming. She remained still for a moment, then lifted one hand slightly, not to stop them, but to acknowledge them, a signal that she was present, that command still existed, even here, even now. Lucas turned his head slightly, watching without stepping closer. Without inserting himself into something that was no longer his place. One of the soldiers glanced at him, just for a second, and then looked away again, not dismissing him, not ignoring him, simply uncertain where he belonged in the structure that had just shifted. Status, the commander said, her voice steady, though quieter than before. The soldiers responded immediately, numbers, readings, projections, all delivered, with the same clarity as before. But beneath it there was something else, something unspoken, as if each report carried an additional weight, a context that had not existed minutes earlier. Lucas exhaled slowly. The air cooler now, easier to pull in, though it still carried the metallic edge of the environment. He shifted his stance, one boot scraping lightly against the ground, and for the first time since he had stepped forward, he allowed himself to feel the exhaustion settling in, not overwhelming, just present, like a reminder that he was still human, still limited, still here. The commander pushed herself up slightly, supported by one of her soldiers, her gaze moving across the group before settling on Lucas again. The distance between them unchanged, but something in the space felt different, less defined by rank, more by choice. You returned, she said, the words simple, but they carried more than acknowledgement. Lucas met her eyes for a moment, then shrugged slightly. A small, almost casual motion that did not match the weight of what had happened. You were still there, he replied, and that was all. No explanation, no justification, just a statement that did not need anything added to it. The soldiers shifted subtly, some turning their helmets toward him again, not in judgment, not in mockery, but in quiet recalibration. One of them lowered its weapon fully to its side. The motion deliberate, echoed a second later by another, and then another, not a command, not an order, just a series of choices made in sequence. The transport above adjusted its position again, stabilizing into a lower hover, its access ramp beginning to extend with a controlled mechanical hum, an invitation, not just for extraction, but for something else, something unspoken. Lucas looked at it briefly, then back at the commander, waiting, not assuming, not stepping forward without direction. She held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then inclined her head. Just slightly, not a bow, not submission, but recognition, clear and unmistakable. You will come with us, she said, not as a command, but as a decision already made. And for a moment, no one moved, because the meaning of those words extended beyond transport, beyond this moment, into something none of them had fully defined yet. Lucas nodded once, slow, accepting not the offer, but the weight behind it, and as he took his first step toward the ramp, the soldiers did not block his path, did not surround him. They simply shifted, creating space where there had been none before, and in that space, for the first time, he was not a prisoner, not a subject, not a mistake, just a human who had made a choice, and that had been enough. The interior of the transport felt colder than the world they had left behind, not in temperature, but in precision, every surface smooth, every edge intentional. The hum of the engine steady and controlled as the ramp sealed shut behind them, with a soft hydraulic hiss that cut off the last traces of distorted light from outside. Lucas stepped forward slowly, his boots meeting a surface that no longer shifted beneath him. The stability almost unfamiliar after the chaos of the ground, his reflection faintly visible in the polished alloy floor, distorted by the residual heat rising from his suit. The air inside carried a sterile sharpness, filtered, measured, untouched by the environment they had just crossed, and yet he could still feel the weight of it in his lungs, a memory that had not faded yet. The soldiers moved around him with renewed structure, their formation reassembling in quiet synchronization as they secured the interior, panels sliding open and closed with precise timing, systems recalibrating, reports passing between them in low tones that blended into the constant background hum. But none of them approached him, none of them reached for restraints, and that absence spoke louder than anything they could have said. Lucas paused near the center of the chamber, his hands resting loosely at his sides, not defensive, not ready, simply present. Across from him the commander was guided onto a raised platform that adjusted to meet her posture, the surface, shifting subtly to support her weight as diagnostic arrays unfolded from the surrounding structure, projecting soft bands of light that moved across her armor and skin, scanning, stabilizing, confirming what they already knew, that she was alive, that she was still here. She dismissed the closest soldier with a slight motion of her hand, not abrupt, not forceful, just enough, and they obeyed immediately, stepping back without hesitation, leaving a space around her that felt intentional, private. She turned her head slightly, her gaze finding Lucas again as if the rest of the room had dimmed. In comparison, you entered our territory without weapon or insignia, she said, her voice steady now, restored. carrying the quiet authority that had defined her before the storm. But beneath it there was something else, something that had not been there earlier, something unmeasured. Lucas exhaled slowly, shifting his weight just enough to ease the tension in his shoulders. "I was not there to fight," he replied, the words simple, unembellished, and for a moment the silence between them, stretched, not empty, but full of everything that had not been said yet. One of the soldiers glanced toward her, waiting for a directive, but none came. She studied him instead, not as a subject, not as an anomaly, but as something she was still trying to understand. "Our records show your unit engaged in active conflict hours before we arrived," she continued, not accusing, not challenging, just stating a fact that did not align with what she had seen. Lucas nodded once, his eyes dropping briefly to the inactive display on his wrist before lifting again. "They did," he said, and that was all. He did not explain the absence of his weapon, did not describe the moment he had let it go, because those details would not translate, not into their system, not into their logic. The commander's gaze lingered on him, searching for something beyond the words, and when she spoke again, her voice lowered just slightly. "You chose not to continue." Lucas met her eyes fully this time. No hesitation, no deflection. "I chose something else," he said, and the room seemed to still around that sentence. The soldiers no longer moving, no longer speaking, as if even their systems had paused to register a concept that did not fit within their parameters. The commander leaned back slightly against the support of the platform, her posture easing not from weakness but from consideration. "And you would make that same choice again," she said, not as a question, but as a conclusion forming. In real time, Lucas did not answer immediately. The hum of the transport filling the space between them, steady, constant, grounding, and then he nodded, once, slow, certain, and that was enough, not proof, not evidence, just enough. She turned her gaze away from him for a brief moment, looking toward the sealed ramp, toward the world they had left behind, and when she looked back, something had shifted, not in her rank, not in her authority, but in the way she held it. "Then perhaps," she said quietly, "we have misunderstood your species." And no one in the room corrected her, because no one could. The transport lifted without warning, not abruptly, but with a smooth inevitability, the floor beneath Lucas shifting just enough for him to feel the change in gravity as the vessel separated from the ground they had left behind, the hum deepening into a steady resonance that traveled through the structure and into his chest, anchoring him in a space that no longer belonged to the battlefield, yet had not fully become anything else. He adjusted his stance slightly, feet shoulder-width apart, instinct guiding him even here, even now, as the external environment faded from view behind sealed alloy walls and layered shielding. The commander remained on the elevated platform, the scanning lights dimming as the systems completed their work, panels retracting with precise efficiency until the space around her returned to its original form, controlled, minimal, intentional. She moved her arm once, testing range, confirming function, and then sat upright without assistance, dismissing the final diagnostic with a subtle motion that required no words. The soldiers responded immediately, returning to their positions along the perimeter, but the formation no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like observation, like a line drawn not to contain him, but to understand him. Lucas remained where he stood, not advancing, not retreating, simply existing within a structure that had not yet decided what to do with him. One of the soldiers stepped forward slightly, just enough to enter the commander's field of vision, trajectory locked. It reported, voice steady, return vector established. She nodded once, acknowledging the information without breaking her focus on Lucas. "Delay it," she said, the instruction quiet but absolute. And for the first time since he had boarded, there was a pause in the system, a fraction of a second where protocol met something else, something that did not come from data or directive. The soldier hesitated, not disobeying, not questioning, simply processing, then inclined its head and stepped back. The command accepted, the course adjusted, the transport holding its path in a suspended arc rather than committing to departure. Lucas noticed the shift immediately, not in the motion of the ship, but in the absence of it. The way the hum stabilized instead of accelerating, the way the air felt held rather than moving forward. He looked toward the commander again, his brow tightening slightly, not in confusion but in recognition of choice. "You are delaying extraction," he said, not as a challenge, just an observation. She regarded him for a moment, her expression unreadable in the way only someone trained to command could maintain. "I am reconsidering assumptions," she replied, and the words carried more weight than any order given before. The soldiers did not move, did not speak, but the space shifted again, tension replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. Lucas exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the floor before lifting again. "That is new," he said, a faint edge of something almost resembling humor in his tone, though it did not quite reach his eyes. The commander tilted her head slightly, studying him. "For us, yes," she admitted, and there was no resistance in the admission, no attempt to mask it, just a simple acknowledgement of something changing. She rose from the platform then, the movement controlled, steady, her balance fully returned, the difference between now and moments before subtle but undeniable. She stepped down from the raised surface and walked toward him, not quickly, not slowly. Each step measured, deliberate, closing the distance that had defined them since the beginning. The soldiers did not intervene, did not reposition, they simply watched, their stillness more significant than any action. She stopped a few feet from him, close enough now that the details of her presence were no longer abstract. The faint iridescence of her skin under the interior lighting, the sharp clarity of her gaze, the absence of any visible weapon despite her rank. "You carried me through an environment my own soldiers calculated as non-survivable," she said, her voice lower now. "Not for secrecy, but for focus. Without armor designed for it. Without directive, without obligation." Lucas met her eyes, his expression steady. "You were still there," he repeated, the same words as before, unchanged, because they did not need to be different. She held his gaze for a long moment, searching, not for weakness, not for deception, but for something that could translate what he had done into something her world could understand. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something that did not come from rank or authority. "Then you will remain," she said, not as a command, not as an offer, but as a decision rooted in something deeper than either, until we understand why. And this time, no one in the room hesitated, because whatever had begun outside in the fire had not ended there. It had followed them here, into the quiet, into the space where logic no longer held all the answers. The transport did not accelerate. It drifted, suspended between departure and decision, its engines holding a steady output that kept them above the fractured surface while the stars beyond the atmosphere remained just out of view, hidden behind layers of cloud and ionized haze. Lucas felt it in the way the vibrations settled into a constant tone, no longer building, no longer changing, just there, like a question waiting for an answer that had not been given yet. The commander stood a few feet from him, close enough now that distance no longer defined their roles, the space between them filled with something quieter than authority, something that did not require rank to exist. Around them the soldiers remained still, but not idle, their attention fixed not on threat assessment, not on external conditions, but on this moment, as if they understood without being told that whatever happened next would matter more than any report they could send back. Lucas shifted his weight slightly, the fatigue in his muscles settling deeper now that movement had stopped, his breathing steady but heavier than before, the absence of adrenaline leaving behind the simple reality of what his body had endured. He rolled one shoulder once, easing the stiffness, and for a brief second his gaze drifted toward the sealed ramp, toward the world they had left behind, a place that already felt distant, not because of space, but because of what had changed since then. "You said you chose something else," the commander said, her voice measured, not demanding, but focused. Lucas looked back at her, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "Yes," he answered, the words simple, unchanged. She studied him for a moment longer, then took another step closer, reducing the distance to something almost conversational. "Your records define your kind by adaptability, by expansion, by survival through dominance," she continued, each word precise, drawn from a system that categorized everything it encountered. "Yet you abandoned your weapon in an active conflict zone." Lucas exhaled slowly, his eyes dropping briefly before returning to hers, not avoiding, just choosing where to begin. There were people there, he said, and the words carried more than explanation. They carried memory, the kind that did not need detail to be understood by the one who held it. The commander's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle adjustment that suggested recalibration. And that outweighed your objective, she said, not questioning, but aligning the pieces as she saw them. Lucas gave a small nod. It did, he replied. The room remained quiet, the soldiers unmoving, but the silence now felt different, less like observation and more like absorption, as if each of them was processing something that did not fit into the structure they had been built to follow. The commander turned slightly, pacing one slow step to the side, her gaze shifting momentarily to the interior wall where a faint display pulsed with navigational data, then back to him. In our doctrine, a decision like that would be classified as a failure of discipline, she said, her tone neutral, but the words held weight, the kind that defined entire systems of thought. Lucas let out a breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. Yeah, he said, I figured. And for a second, just a second, the corner of her expression softened, not into a smile, but into something less rigid, something closer to understanding. She stopped moving then, facing him fully again. And yet, she continued, that same decision resulted in my survival. The statement hung in the air, not as a contradiction, but as a fracture in the logic she had been trained to trust. Lucas shrugged slightly, the motion small, unassuming. Guess it depends on what you measure, he said. And this time the silence that followed was different from all the others. It was not empty, not waiting. It was full of something. Neither of them could fully define yet. The commander held his gaze, and for the first time since they had met, there was no distance left in it. No hierarchy, no assumption, only recognition, clear and undeniable. Then we have been measuring the wrong things, she said quietly, and no system in the room corrected her, because for once, there was nothing in their data that could. The transport finally moved, not with urgency but with purpose, its engines shifting from a suspended hum into a controlled ascent that pressed gently against Lucas's stance, just enough to remind him that they were leaving something behind, the fractured ground fading into a distant pattern beneath layers of atmosphere as the exterior viewports adjusted their opacity, revealing a muted expanse of cloud and dim light stretching endlessly outward. Inside, nothing rushed, nothing changed abruptly. But everything had already changed in ways no system had recorded. The soldiers remained at their posts, their formation restored but no longer rigid, their attention no longer divided between threat and protocol, now centered on something quieter, something that had no designation in their structure. Lucas stood where he had been, his posture steady, his breathing even again, the fatigue still present but no longer overwhelming. Just a part of him now, like everything else he carried without speaking. The commander had not moved far, still within a few feet, but the space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like balance, something shared rather than imposed. She turned slightly, her gaze shifting toward the viewport as the last trace of the battlefield disappeared beneath the clouds, her reflection faintly visible against the glass, layered over the fading world behind it. There will be a report, she said, her voice calm, measured, but softer than it had ever been. Not for effect, but because there was no need to project anymore. Lucas nodded once, his eyes following hers briefly before returning to the room. I figured, he replied, the words simple, unchanged. She looked back at him then, her expression unreadable in the way only someone who had spent a lifetime in command could maintain. But beneath it, something had settled, something that did not need to be hidden. It will not match the data we have, she continued. It will not align with our models of your species. Lucas let out a quiet breath, something close to a sigh, but without weight. They usually do not, he said, and there was no pride in it, no defiance, just a statement that existed on its own. The commander studied him for a moment longer, then inclined her head slightly, not formal, not ceremonial, just enough to acknowledge what could not be translated into rank or code. Around them, one by one, the soldiers lowered their weapons completely, not in sequence, not by command, but as individual choices made in the same moment, the sound of metal shifting into rest echoing softly through the chamber. And then there was stillness again, not empty, but complete. The transport broke through the upper atmosphere, the light outside shifting into something clearer, colder. The stars beginning to emerge one by one as distant points of reference in a space that no longer felt indifferent. Lucas stepped closer to the viewport, just enough to see them fully, his reflection merging with the scattered light beyond, his silhouette no longer defined by what he lacked. No weapon, no rank, no place in their system, but by what he had carried through it. The commander joined him, not beside, not behind, but close enough that the distance between them could no longer be measured in feet or meters, only in understanding. Neither of them spoke for a moment, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to justify, only the quiet recognition of something that had crossed between them without permission, without design, something that would not fit into any report no matter how precise it tried to be. And as the stars reflected faintly in the viewport, layered over both of their images, the commander spoke one final time, her voice barely above the hum of the ship. In a system built on power, she said, you brought something we could not calculate. Lucas did not look at her, did not answer immediately, because the answer was already there, in the silence, in the space they shared. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, almost lost in the vastness beyond the glass. It is not power, he said. It is just being human. And for the first time since they had left the ground, there was no need for anything else, no correction, no response, only the quiet, lasting realization that in a galaxy ruled by strength, the smallest choice had changed everything.